Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 259. I'm so pleased to be joined today by my new friend, Rachel Wojo, a mom whose faith has been forged in the fires of both caregiving and grief. Rachel shares the story of parenting her daughter Taylor, who was diagnosed with Sanfilippo syndrome, a rare and terminal degenerative condition often called childhood Alzheimer's. From the early signs of delayed milestones to the eventual loss of every skill, Rachel walks us through the sacred, heartbreaking, and sometimes joyful moments of raising a child with special needs. Through it all, prayer became Rachel's lifeline. Today, she's the author of Desperate Prayers and the creator of the 3-word prayers approach, a lifeline when words are hard to find. She has an active writing and speaking ministry, and she hosts the Untangling Prayer with Rachel Wojo podcast, which I will link in the show notes. Rachel's story is one of deep faith, honest struggle, and the comforting presence of God in the hardest moments. Let's listen in. Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
I am so honored to be here, Jill. I really appreciate your ministry and all that you are doing to help others.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. You know, I've had the opportunity to personally meet most of the guests that have appeared on the podcast, but that's not the case with you. So I'm going to be getting to know you along with our listeners today. I want to start by giving you the opportunity to just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
Sure. So I live in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. It's a very metropolitan area. We sort of live on the outskirts of that area. I have 5 children at home currently. It is quite the revolving door. I have a daughter who lives next door as well. So those are our 6 children on earth. We also have 2 children in heaven, one that we lost between 2 of our children and through miscarriage.
Mm-hmm.
And that was many years ago. And the second we had on this planet for 22 years until she went home to be with the Lord January 2nd, 2019. So life is very full from the past and very full for what we know God has for the future.
Amen. So the daughter that you mentioned that's in heaven now, she was your firstborn, right? Her name is Taylor.
Correct.
And she had
Yes.
a little bit of a rough start. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, she did have a rough start. I was married to a preacher boy who was studying to be in ministry. He actually had graduated from Bible college and was candidating at churches. And we had this beautiful, bubbly little girl. When she was born, she had an FGAR score of 0. She was born emergency C-section. I just remember that the birth pains were not progressing. I had determined I wanted to have a natural labor, and it just got to the point to where I was like, I can't do this anymore because she's not progressing and the pain is just continuing on and on. And so it felt like something wasn't quite right. But as a first time mom, you don't know what to expect during the birthing process. And so when she was born and I just saw that blue baby come out of me, I remember glancing up thinking, this is not what I thought this would be like. And I remember being so relieved to hear that cry and just being happy that she
Mm-hmm.
was alive. And so because of her traumatic birth, many of her developmental delays for the first 3 years of her life were pointed back to that time, saying, well,
Sure.
she lost oxygen, and that is to be her her delays, her lack of progress at a normal pace are to be expected. So she hit most of her milestones a little late. Walking, sitting, crawling, all of those were just delayed by a month or two, a little slower than normal. But then it came to her speech, and that especially was a slow progression. And it wasn't until the day that she actually lost a skill that I had this conviction in my heart that something more was wrong than what the doctors had been telling me. That developmental delay was not the cause of her issues. I remember sitting there saying, Taylor, put your socks on. And she had put her socks on so many times before that. And I watched her, I looked over at her. As a parent, you're often rushing around trying to do two or three things at once. And I just remember stopping and looking at her and realizing she doesn't know how to put her socks on. And so at that moment, it was the first time that I understood she was losing skills, not just not gaining them appropriately. And I determined in my mama's heart that we would just push to get the answers. Took a year and a half before we received that diagnosis of mucopolysaccharidosis, a rare metabolic disorder that is neurologically degenerative. Her type is called Sanfilippo syndrome, and it is often called a childhood Alzheimer's because gradually every skill is lost.
Mm. That had to be such a sinking feeling when you realized that she was losing skills like that.
It was a very strange moment. I can
Hmm.
remember it so clearly. Those times in your life, I'm sure, where
Sure.
it's just such a defining moment that
Hmm.
you never forget it. And that
Hmm.
moment was certainly one of those.
Wow. And during this period, your marriage began to fall apart. Would you
Mm.
mind talking about that?
Well, before we even received diagnosis, I knew that something was wrong. Each church that my husband was candidating at, we had several offers for positions, and he kept declining the positions. I really didn't understand as a young woman. I was fairly naive. I had grown up in a Christian home and a Christian school and gone on to Bible college. And so it took well, at 4 of the 5 years that we were married, I realized that he was having an affair and had been having that affair. And so at that point, my life really was turned upside down, and I sought the Lord, and we sought counseling, but in the end, the choice was that we would divorce. And so that white picket fence dream came crumbling down in many ways because I found myself in a place I never thought I would be as a single mom to a special needs child.
Wow. And then God brought redemption to that situation with a wonderful new relationship. But then you went through the loss of your mom and then those
Right.
concerns about Taylor's development. How did all of these blows, one after another, impact your walk with the Lord?
Mm. Well, as a 20-something-year-old, I was 27 when God gave me my second marriage, and Matt and I married and began our life together. And within that first year, actually, my mom didn't even get to attend our wedding because she was so ill with her leukemia that she couldn't make the drive or fly. There was no way to get her there. And so it was a very tough year adjusting to a new relationship, losing my mom, trying to figure out what was happening with our sweet Taylor. And I just remember seeking God and saying, you know, do I have the faith of my parents, or is this the faith of my own? It really was for me. Do I choose to run to God or run away from Him? And I think most of us walk through those kinds of situations at some point where we have to choose, do we believe God is who He says He is or not? And for me, it was quite a wrestling for a few years. Even at times later in my Christian life, there were frustrations and moments where I just was mad at God because I thought, if you are sovereign, you can change these circumstances with
Sure.
just a word. I really wrestled through that journey, but I will say that even when I stepped on God, I didn't ever fully run away from God. I would hold Him at a distance, but in my heart of hearts, I really wanted to be close to Him. And I believed that His word was true and His promises were true. So I pursued an open relationship with Him. And that choice to try to get as close to Him as I could and figure out for my own logical reasoning what was happening was actually the best choice I could have made, because even when logically things aren't going the way we want them to, and we can't understand them in our finite minds, when we choose to pursue God, He promises that when we seek Him, we'll find Him. And I surely did find Him in the midst of all of that.
Mm, absolutely. I'm so thankful that you did seek Him in that way because that made all the difference in your journey.
Just that pivotal choice. Yeah. It's that heart of hearts moment where we say, okay, God, I do believe you are real, but I need to see you. I need to feel you. I need to understand who you are. Help me do that.
Mhm.
And I just found that He meets us in those moments. And when we continually make that choice, then the relationship grows deeper and deeper, just as it would with anyone we choose to have a relationship with.
That's right. And it is a choice. It's a conscious choice
Mm,
that we have to make.
hmm.
We have to be
Yes.
intentional. Yeah. So, talk about some of the joys of parenting a child with special needs.
Hmm. Well, I think that we have a unique opportunity to see the world in a different way. As a parent of biological children who are atypical and what we would, most of us would consider to be healthy, very healthy, then having a special needs child, I think we can have this opinion that life is better when we're healthy. And I think what God showed me is that while health is a gift, we can have just as much joy when things aren't going our way or aren't the way we would like for them to be, as we can when they are going our way. And so I think that's what the Lord opened me up to, was seeing that His peace and His presence is available to us no matter where we are and what life stage or season. And I just saw so many beautiful things happen where people gathered together in unique ways that brought joy not only to our family, but to others as well.
Yeah, that's a gift. What are
Mm.
some of the challenges of parenting a special needs child?
Well, for most who are probably listening to this episode, I don't have to go into the challenges very much
Right.
because
They
you
know,
know
don't
them.
they?
But
Hmm.
I do think it's good to say them, right? I think the challenges are that your life is not normal compared to your neighbors, and everything that you do or accomplish is centered around whether or not you have the help that you need in order to be able to do that. So life was very simple for us for many years because our bandwidth was limited. Time, finances, resources, limitations on what Taylor could and couldn't do, what she could or couldn't handle. We had seasons to that life of challenges. So in the early years, she was running everywhere and super hyper. And so controlling her
Mhm.
was a major feat. And then as she began to lose her ability to run, then the challenge became trying to keep her moving. What was
Sure.
so challenging at the beginning as far as slowing her down then became, okay, we want to keep her moving as long as possible. And so as she grew and became heavier, which I know that many of the caregivers out there can relate to this, it takes a toll on your body. So
Mm.
not just your mind, but you know, as as a 40 something year old who is packing around a 100-pound child,
Yeah.
it's no easy feat to do all the lifting and the carrying and everything that is needed. And then there's the challenge of needing help, but not truly wanting it. It is hard to have people in your home caregiving. It feels like a bit of an infringement on your privacy for
Sure.
your own family to have outsiders come in and be present. And so that's another challenge that I think is not often spoken about, but is
Hmm.
a very real issue. And then I think maybe the last one I would say is just not knowing. For us, Taylor had a seizure disorder, and at any moment, truly, the Lord could take her home with the seizure disorder. And so we didn't know if she would have the 10 to 15 years that the lifespan was designated to her medically, or if God would gift us with more. And He did gift us with more. But then in the years of suffering, you think, how long, Lord? How
Yeah.
long will she have to suffer in this way? And so processing all of that is quite the journey for sure.
Yes. Yes. We got just a little taste of that with our daughter. She was 17, healthy otherwise, but then she had brain cancer. And
Mm,
so, towards the end of that journey, she became very dependent on us for everything, lots of lifting and transferring and having to feed her and all of those things. And it was hard. It
mhm.
was hard. But again, it was something, we loved her so much that it was, it just came natural to want to meet her needs. So we got a little bit of a taste into the life of a special needs parent that didn't last very long for us, but I can certainly see some of those issues. We didn't have outside people coming in, and I can see how that would be difficult
Yeah.
because it does infringe on your family and your privacy. So Taylor's health was really beginning to decline by the end of 2018, but there was something really special that happened just after Christmas that year. Talk about that.
Yeah. So Taylor always loved my second husband, Matt, who just had a special way with her. And she loved him dearly, and he loved her, but he never wanted to infringe on the relationship that she had with her birth father.
Hmm.
Her birth father stayed in the picture until she was 12. And then gradually, because of Taylor's special needs and her not recognizing him, it sort of was a slow fade to the
Hmm.
point to where he just didn't see her anymore. The last time he saw her was when she was 12. And so when she turned 18 and became legal age, he signed over the guardianship rights to me. And we never really thought anything. Matt had been Taylor's father for such a long time, as far as caring for her and providing for our family so that I could work from home, and so much of the heavy lifting, not just mentally and physically, but spiritually, the weight that he carried on my behalf and on her behalf as a father, and loving her as if she were his own, caring for her as if she were his own. And one day in November of 2018, he just had this thought, and we thought of it before, but never really talked about it. I think honestly the issue was that he did not want to see her name to be anything other than his own when he looked at that gravestone.
Sure.
And we knew that she would not live many more years. And so he said, I really want to adopt Taylor. I want her to carry my name. I've been her father these years, and I just believe that I would like to call her my own. And so we began the process. If you know anything about adoption at all, it's usually minimum 6 month process. And I thought, Lord, this is never going to happen, but we'll try.
Yeah.
And so we began the process legally. To make a long story short, miraculously, we saw miracle after miracle of how God just brought our situation to fruition to the point to where on the last day of the year 2018, we were able to go to the courthouse, and Taylor, with our little family, Taylor was declared. She waited at home for us. She was declared Matt's child, and he was declared as her father. And I just remember the anvil coming down, and my oldest son was able to pound the anvil and hear the judge's words, adoption granted. And
Wow.
it just felt like such a miracle moment.
Yeah. I love that story. And I saw that in your book. And I just had to ask you about that because it's such a beautiful picture of God's redemptive grace, of how he adopted us into his family. And it's just beautiful to me.
It is a crazy thing. I do have to say one thing about that. Jill, I did not know that when a child is adopted, their birth certificate is reissued as if the adopted parent were present at the time of their birth. And when we received that birth certificate in the mail, it was actually after Taylor had died. So
Wow.
she died, we received her death certificate, and then we received this birth certificate with her new name on it and Matt listed as her father. It was just such an amazing picture for me of what it will be like in heaven. Can you imagine our death certificate is issued and then we get to heaven and God passes over the adoption certificate and says, oh no, you're my son, you're my daughter, you've been mine all along. How precious is that?
Mm. Oh, I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. So Taylor graduated to heaven just a few days after the adoption. And you talk a little bit about her final days and moments in your book and how difficult they were. Yet you felt the presence of the Lord with you in those moments. Would you mind sharing about that experience?
I really believe that most of us are closest to heaven at birth or at death.
Yes.
And so we have this holy privilege, this window of opportunity, if you will, to experience the last moments or the first moments of a person's life in a different way than what we tend to experience the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so, especially at death, I think there's this window of opportunity to open ourselves up to understanding that there is a gateway to heaven from our mortal bodies to the spiritual realm that we can't really comprehend, honestly. But on a spiritual note, I believe that the windows to our soul are opened in a way that they aren't otherwise at other times. And there's an opportunity to have an awareness of God that we maybe wouldn't otherwise have. And so I truly believe that I experienced that. I tell people, there was no bright light. I did not hear angels singing. I did not see angels singing.
Right.
None of those things happened for me. And I don't doubt that maybe some of those things have happened for others. But for me, there was an incredible sense of God's peace that fell over the room And just Taylor and I were in the room at the time. And I remember recognizing God is big enough to hold me on earth and hold her in heaven at the same time. And He is the bridge to the gap of our physical and spiritual realities. And
Hmm.
so I just believe that it was a defining moment for me where I now have an ongoing spiritual awareness that maybe I didn't have before that moment.
Yeah, that is an experience like no other when you get to walk your child home in that
Mm,
way. We had that opportunity too. And though it was excruciatingly difficult, it was also beautiful at the same time.
right.
And I'm thankful for that. I've often heard from parents who had children with special needs that they struggle sometimes to find purpose after
Mm.
the loss of that child and after so many years of caregiving. Did you experience that at all? And if so, how did you work through that?
Well, I guess I would say that maybe purpose wasn't my issue, but
Hmm.
identity was my
Oh,
issue.
sure. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
So how I saw myself was the problem, not
Hmm.
necessarily what God had given me to do, because I understood my purpose very well, but how I saw myself, I had been Taylor's mom for so many years and operated in that role as a caregiver for so many years that it was hard to see myself as anything else. And I think I was saved in a way by the fact that I had other children at home. I know there are many listening who don't have that. You know, they've lost a child and it's their only child, or they've lost their youngest child and there are no children in the home. For me, I feel very blessed that I still had children in the home. And so I feel like God was able to help me understand that my role as a parent was not over yet for that reason, and that my identity as a mother would always be there, whether Taylor was in heaven or on earth. That maybe performing that role looked a little different, and seeing myself as the way God sees me and not necessarily just as someone who is in one type of service for him versus another type of service for
Mm,
him. I think
sure.
it's very easy as a caregiver to get accustomed to the physicality of everything, the demand of everything that has to be done and the order in which it has to be done, to the
Right.
point to where we only see ourselves as mechanical beings who have to walk this journey, and we put on a, I don't know, mentality maybe that serves us as a preservation mode. And we just put one step in front of the other and make what happen has to happen in the moments. But then when a season ends, like with the death of a child, you find yourself questioning, okay, who am I really? And what is my purpose on this
Right.
planet? And I'll be honest, when my daughter died, that I wished that I could die with her. And I
Hmm.
think most parents, if they are honest, they feel that way. It's
Yes.
not the natural recourse. It's not the way God intended it. Imagine the very first lost mom is Eve. And if you look at her story as a lost mom, there's nothing in the Bible that really says the heart, explains the heart of what happened to her when one son murdered the other son in cold blood. But can you imagine the reality that washed over her as a parent, recognizing my choice, my sin is what caused this
Mm,
problem? And
mm,
so I think as a result, many of us as parents, when talking about purpose and identity, we carry guilt and shame that is not ours to bear because we think, what could I have done differently? How could this have changed? Was there anything that I could have done differently? And so we put those issues on repeat in our minds when God is saying, I love you so much. I love the world so much that I gave my son. There is no guilt and shame for you. It's covered by my son, Jesus. And you can come to me as your heavenly Father with no guilt or shame, with no regrets, with no issues with the past, but with a full knowledge of my peace and my presence available to you. And that is sometimes hard for us to choose, right? To choose that purpose, peace, and presence that the Lord has to offer versus what we think we've been placed on this planet to do, especially as caregivers.
As we close this first part of Rachel's story, I hope you've been encouraged by her honesty, her faith, and the beautiful way she reflects God's grace in the midst of deep loss. In next week's episode, we'll continue our conversation as she shares how her experiences led to her latest book, Desperate Prayers. We'll talk about what it means to pray when words are hard to find, how to define healing from an eternal perspective, and how we can move beyond survival mode after child loss. You won't want to miss the wisdom and hope she brings in part 2. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I look forward to sharing the rest of our chat with you next Wednesday.